Okay, thank you, Hardy, very much. That's very kind of you, my brother. Thanks, everyone, and welcome. How's everyone doing? How's energy? Okay. I'm realizing I looked at the program and I saw that the only thing between all of you and a boat cruise is me and Rob. So we'll try to keep it as lively as possible. I should say at the outset that I am speaking here in my personal capacity and not on behalf of the U.S. State Department or the U.S. government. But with that in mind, I've been asked to... I'm sorry, Mary? We hope so. Mary, please don't cause problems for me here. Anyhow, so I was asked, along with Rob, to talk a little bit with you about the role of external actors. Is this me or is this somebody else? Oh, okay, got it. No, just, it's okay, Yallah. Okay, to talk about the role of external actors in nonviolent movements. And it's day 3 of the Fletcher Summer Institute, so it's probably become very clear to folks here that what is decisive in nonviolent campaigns and movements is what activists do locally, and what indigenous movements do. What they do ultimately is decisive. There's no such thing as exporting or importing a nonviolent campaign or movement from the outside. And while outside actors can help human rights actors, Democrats, dissidents, and help create and support space for nonviolent activism, ultimately what the movements do themselves is decisive. So with that as the frame, I thought we'd maybe start with a few questions just to get the conversation going. So how important in general is external assistance to the success of nonviolent campaigns? So just very briefly, what the data shows right now, and I've got the data person in the room who can discuss this in a bit more detail if there are questions. What we found basically was that direct state support to major nonviolent campaigns had no significant impact on the effectiveness of those campaigns. But at the same time, support received by nonviolent campaigns and movements by INGOs, international NGOs, was associated with progress in the nonviolent campaign after the first year. So it seems that what INGOs do and the capacity that they help provide is actually very important. Also, a patron's withdrawal of support from a regime is associated with nonviolent campaign success. So government-to-government relations seems to matter a lot in determining some of the outcomes of these campaigns. But certainly compared to armed struggles and insurgencies, which really rely a lot on external actors for funding, for weapons, for training, generally speaking, nonviolent movements rely a lot on their own resources, ingenuity, creativity to succeed. But at the same time, governments, I think, and I'll be speaking more from a governmental perspective, whereas Rob will speak more from a non-governmental perspective, governments do have a role to play in supporting Democrats and human rights activists, and as I said, helping to create a supportive environment for nonviolent resistance. So what type of supports in general do nonviolent activists need? And I don't mean just from governments, but in general. There are probably 4 main categories of support, and we can go into detail a little bit later on. But those 4 categories would be training in, say, leadership and civic organizing and in strategic planning, so the training aspect. The second sort of category of support would probably be ways to inhibit repression. So how do you address governments that are using repression against nonviolent activists and movements? This kind of support can be incredibly helpful to movements. Third category, providing resources. So in some cases, this involves strike funds. In other places, it involves communications equipment, trucks in other places. So material assistance to campaigns and movements. And then finally, what can outside actors do to help support defections? So whether that means dictators leaving power, leaving a country, encouraging members of the regime and security forces to essentially stop obeying illegal orders. So those are sort of a few categories of nonviolent assistance. Now, the challenge with all this in general, with external support to nonviolent movements, is that a lot of governments really don't want this to happen. We're seeing in more and more places around the world the space for civic organizing closing down as authoritarian regimes who took the lessons from, say, the Color Revolution in Central Eastern Europe, the recent Arab Spring movements, that generally it's problematic when nonviolent activists begin to discuss with each other and learn from other movements outside, seek resources, seek advice from the outside, and they're doing a lot to try to prevent that from happening. Whether that's imposing stringent NGO laws, which is happening in many countries now, whether it's penalizing activists for receiving any kind of assistance whatsoever. And so we're seeing the space closing in many places, and a lot of resistance to external support to nonviolent movements. So this raises a question in general, and I open it as a question. I think probably Peter will address this in his remarks tomorrow, is whether there should be a responsibility in the international community, a government and non-government, to assist nonviolent activists and movements. Should this be a responsibility? And what are the rights that you have as nonviolent activists to receive assistance? What are the rights that you have under current international human rights law to receive assistance? So those are just a few framing questions. So the pros and cons of governmental support. The cons are probably obvious to most people. I will be honest with you. State support, and certainly U.S. government support for nonviolent activist movements, will never be consistent. You will often perceive it to be incredibly untimely and probably quite bureaucratic. Now, there are certain things that governments can do well and certain pots of money that can be very effective, but there's always going to be a case of competing priorities, and this often leaves many activists in places frustrated because they expect consistency, and consistency is not there. But your starting point when you're looking at whether to think about external support from governments is knowing that there's not a perfect track record or consistency, and that sometimes getting funding may require you to go through the hurdles because, for example, the State Department is responsible to taxpayers. So we have a lot of rules and regulations that make activists' lives more difficult perhaps than they ought to be. So that's a con. The biggest, probably the biggest negative is the second point that, and my guess is that a number of people in this room have experienced this, that any form of external support to nonviolent movements is used by regimes to delegitimize them. So they're declared foreign agents, they're declared traitors, they're declared, whatever, because they have contact and maybe receiving resources from the outside. And regimes that have very sophisticated propaganda machines are usually very good at using this argument against nonviolent activists and movements. So on the other hand, we all know that nonviolent activists need funds just to be able to mobilize people, produce T-shirts, posters, this sort of thing. They need to be able to access knowledge and awareness of what other movements have done and what they can learn from other cases, and acquire skills that can be helpful in mobilizing people in their struggle. And they need to be able to connect to global solidarity networks. So external support is needed in this regard. The other pro, governments have leverage over other governments. And so at times, when they use these relationships effectively, and diplomats as well, they can help inhibit the worst forms of regime repression. And we'll talk about ways that diplomats notably have done this. And in general, solidarity from members and representatives of governments can boost morale. At a time when activists in many places feel that nobody is watching, nobody cares about their struggle, to be able to know that people are watching, they care about their legitimate rights, they care about their struggles, can sometimes give a boost in these difficult situations. So a publication that has become very important to me is actually, now that when I switched over from the NGO world from ICNC to state, is called the Diplomat's Handbook for Democracy Development Support. This is a booklet. It's actually a field guide for diplomats and, frankly, for activists, in basically all the tools available to diplomats and embassies and consulates out at post overseas to support human rights activists, Democrats with a small d, those involved in nonviolent movements. And the book also describes how these tools have been used in different countries and contexts rather. And so I think this book, and it's available online, it's a living document, so they have lots of case studies, lots of anecdotes. It's a very colorful publication. It's actually important for activists too, because when you're out in the field and you're contemplating support from governments, and by the way, this book is not just US State Department. This was a publication of the Community of Democracy. So this is North, South, all the democratic countries in the world came together to produce this booklet. And so for activists, knowing what tools are available and what resources posts, meaning embassies, consulates, diplomats have, and can help you, is a way for you to advocate. So I highly encourage folks here to take a look at this guide. So there's not enough time to go through all these various tools, and really these are only a few of probably about 100. But I think some of these are worth honing in on. You know, meetings with activists are so important. You know, when you're a diplomat in a country, oftentimes we're more comfortable with bilateral relations with elites. But it's so important to meet with civil society activists, with grassroots, to get a real picture of what's happening on the ground. So this is something that should be the responsibility of diplomats. And then using diplomatic immunity essentially to show solidarity with dissidents and nonviolent activists. So I think this is one particular area where diplomats have been able to prevent violence being used against activists by merely deploying their physical presence. So, you know, a couple examples of this. There was, and our Ukrainian friends here probably know the name of this activist, but diplomats from the French embassy, from the European Commission, basically showed up at the home of a Ukrainian youth activist right before security forces were going to arrest him, and essentially prevented that from happening. That's one example. In Cuba, every time the mothers in white, the ladies in white rather, protest, there are often diplomats out there interacting with them as to serve as a bit of a deterrent. And so this is being used in many places to help, you know, prevent violence being used against activists. And then it ranges some of these from, you know, least risky and invasive to more aggressive. But I think this idea of also demarches to foreign governments, so this is specific instructions to governments, stop doing that, you know, raising the case of political prisoners and dissidents, flagging their treatment, this sort of thing, diplomats can do very effectively. So the funding and training thing. So this is often a double-edged sword when diplomats and posts give funding to groups and movements. Like we said, the regime can use that against the movements, but at the same time, small amounts of money that are given to groups can be incredibly effective, especially if they're just starting up. And so in physical deployment and solidarity, I think this is an interesting case where, again, diplomats can help to inhibit violence and show solidarity and show that the world is watching. In worst case scenario, when there is extreme threats against activists, the ability to provide asylum and sanctuary to activists has often been used by diplomats. It was actually used in our embassy in Beijing right after Tiananmen to welcome Chinese participants in the Tiananmen protests, and it's been used in different places around the world. And then, you know, being able to use bilateral relations essentially to discourage regimes and security forces from using violence against protesters, I think is one of the most important things governments can do to help nonviolent activists and movements. So for example, to use the example of Ukraine again, in 2004, a lot of telephone calls were made to high-ranking officials in the Ukrainian government and security forces not to use violent repression against the activists. And I think in this particular case, it actually made a difference. So you should be aware of this as activists and make sure that your interlocutors in the embassies and consulates are also, that is on their radar screen. So just to show a very brief 1-minute clip, this was you know, one of the, I think, good examples of how a diplomat used his immunity and his ambassadorship to show solidarity with nonviolent protesters. Get the flash player. We need the flash player.
Let me see what I can do.
That's okay. So if we don't have...
Keep talking. I'll go at it for a second.
Okay. That's okay.
Okay.
Well, essentially, this was a very short video of when, I should tell you, I've been working on Syria for the past year, and I've been out in Turkey working with the Syrian opposition. So the video was a 1 minute of when our ambassador to Syria, Ambassador Robert Ford, traveled to Hama, which had been the site of a massive massacre in the 1980s. He basically disobeyed the regime's orders not to travel outside of Damascus, and he showed up at the entrance to the city. The people in Hama, first of all, didn't believe it was an American ambassador. They couldn't believe he would come out and be with them during their nonviolent demonstrations. And it was just a remarkable moment. And even, you know, talking with activists today, it's one thing, because there's a lot of, let's say, criticism of U.S. policy towards Syria. But in this case, it's one activity that all Syrians remember, and they say it was one of the strongest signs of support and solidarity that they had experienced until that point. So, you know, for me, this was, you know, one of the highlights in an otherwise incredibly difficult and sad situation.
Slides on the card.
Yeah. No. How do I get back, Cardi? Okay. So just to end with other government tools, and then we'll let Rob talk about the non-governmental side. I mean, things that you all think about where governments have influence. Obviously, using aid conditionally to support certain human rights and democracy goals. And this is both economic aid and military aid. So, for example, there have been instances after the Dili massacre in East Timor when the U.S. stopped providing military aid to the Indonesian regime. So these are ways that, you know, governments can use their military-to-military relations in a way that can help. Again, never consistently applied, and this is often to the consternation of activists who think that we should use this leverage more often and effectively, but that's often a very important one. Sanctions. We could talk for hours about whether sanctions are a good idea or a bad idea. Often, I find that the most effective sanctions are the ones that are very targeted and that go after the wallets and the bank accounts of dictators and their families. So freezing assets, travel bans against leaders in authoritarian regimes and their children can often be very effective in applying pressure on them. Companies. So for example, companies now play a bigger and bigger role, and often companies are involved in providing technologies to regimes that are using it against their people. And so I think there's not been so much research done in this area, but I think that this is an area of Blue Coat in Syria. It was a big deal when it was uncovered that this company was providing technology to the Assad regime, that it was using against Syrians. And I think governments, and they do, have the ability to pressure companies to stop selling this technology and to use technology to support activists. So for example, Google or Twitter kept operations going during the Green Revolution in Iran, basically at the request of many people, but it was good because it allowed the people to continue to communicate. Golden parachute. So the idea of using incentives to get dictators, authoritarians, others to leave a country. Now, this is fraught with controversy, notably when people are talking about transitional justice and do we really allow dictators to leave. But I think in certain cases, it's good for peace for the person to leave the country in order to get on with the process of reconciliation. So with examples being Marcos being given a free ride out of the Philippines, and Ben Ali leaving Tunisia, though I'd be curious to hear our colleagues' thought on whether that was a good move or not. So these are examples of helping dictators leave. And then supporting free media. I mean, often the first thing to be clamped down in these environments is the media. Because the regimes want complete control over the communication. And so supporting radio networks, as has been done in Afghanistan, where there was a nationwide network of media, radio, internet, TV. This is probably a very important way for governments to help activists. Yes.
I want to say about very important tools for Russia.
Yeah.
I does mean Magnitsky bill because it's really tools. It's very good lawyer. According to this lawyer, bad Russian officials, corrupted officials, in accounts of these officials closed American sites, American USA. Mm-hmm. And it's very important for Russians because we know then we can send in USA a list with these bad corrupted people, and accounts of these people will be closed. Yeah. And these people cannot move in USA. And it's very important because many Russian officials send money, buy Russian resource, nature resource, mm-hmm. and get money and send this money in accounts in USA. And family of these Russian officials living in USA. And it's very good tools for Russian activists.
Yeah. We've heard very positive things from activists. So as you probably know, the government, then there was like a tit for tat. So when that was implemented, then the Russian government then sort of implemented a similar law to prevent U.S. So this is often the case that there's governmental tit for tat. But I think, at least for the Democrats and the activists, this was a very positive step. And by the way, the ambassador in Russian, Mike McFaul, is sort of a close member of this family and is very well versed in this, for one thing. Mike McFaul knows this very well, and he's been incredibly supportive of the work that ICNC, I think, has been doing over the years.
And it's more important than grants for the Russian activists. It's more important than money.
Good. How should we do this? So Rob, you want to, because I think the more interesting stuff's going to come out in the sort of discussion period, so you want to do the... Yeah, then we can open up for discussion.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And, as Maria said, my discussion will be sort of the flip side of some of the efforts made by international non-governmental organizations to support the efforts of people around the world involved in struggles of nonviolence, of peace building, conflict resolution, in a way that really is quite different than the original origin of international NGOs, in the sense of providing assistance, material assistance, and a needs-based, needs-focused approach. There's been a major change, as many of you know, in terms of the focus and prioritization of advocating on behalf of others as part of an intervention strategy for international organizations. And what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about some of the major changes that have happened in this sphere over the last, say, 20 years or so. I should mention, by the way, that the underlying theme of the whole week is something that's really quite personal to me, because my parents, for example, my dad's from Northern England, a working class mill town in Northern England, and he came to America as an immigrant. My mother's from Jamaica, a very tiny little village in the middle of Jamaica, who came to America as an immigrant, and they met in the early 50s, and of course could not get married at that time, and were very active in the civil rights movement before it was sort of widely accepted that there would be a mixed race couple actively involved in trying to pressure for change. And then ultimately they moved north to Boston, where it was legal to get married, which is why I'm from here. And I did study engineering. I was an engineer, and I thought for a while that, you know what, I don't think this should be my focus, given the legacy left for the people, from the people who are involved in that struggle. Really, should I do engineering, or should I follow the path that they started? So that's what led me to go and spend about 20 years working on nothing but work around conflict resolution, human rights, international development in a lot of different difficult places in the world, in the civil war in Angola and Rwanda and Cambodia and Laos and Nicaragua and lots of other places. So with that in mind, my thinking has been trying to uncover what are the key elements of international actors trying to provide support to these movements, social change processes in some of the poorest and most violent places on the planet. That's the nature of what I've been working on, and I'll just try and give you some of the overview from the kind of theory briefly, and then give some concrete examples, and then finish with some of the key points that I've taken away from this over 20 years. So quickly, the main tool that a lot of international NGOs use is trying to advocate, as I mentioned, on behalf of others. So let's just take a quick look at how some people define this. Some of the major organizations, like say Save the Children, would define this as the act of supporting a cause to produce a desired change. Okay, sounds simple enough, actually. CARE makes it a little bit more sort of explicit about it, the deliberateness of the process to influence those who make policy decisions. Now, it's a bit more of a narrower view. It probably is the world that a lot of international NGOs work in. Then there's a kind of well-known scholar in this area, Paul Nelson, who I like this definition, mobilizing moral outrage into political action. And that's not typically, when NGOs go and look for funding, they go to donors, they don't say, people want to hear that we're buying X number of kilos of food to be transported. They don't want to hear that we're mobilizing moral outrage. That's not what they're paying money to you to do. But actually, that's what NGOs are doing many of the cases. So, looking more concretely at what this actually means, when we say advocacy, strictly speaking, traditionally, this has meant someone who's officially engaged to represent someone else as a sort of specialist, as an expert. And a key notion here is that the person who's engaging the representative has the right to speak about their issue or not speak about their issue. They could leave it to you, they might not, and they have the complete and total right to dismiss you if they're not happy with what you're doing, if they are the ones who are in charge of bringing you on in the first place. Now, there is also another notion of advocacy, which is to take up one's cause as if it were your own. And in this case, it's not really clear what right the people on whose behalf you're speaking hold in terms of dismissing you or disagreeing with you or choosing to speak or not to speak. And yet, this is really the more standard model of how we work as international NGOs on advocating for others. And then one that I've always liked is just pressing for a certain course of action. You don't necessarily have to claim that you're an expert. You don't have to claim that you're speaking on behalf of others. You can just simply say, this is a feature in society that is wrong, and I want to change it. But it does lead to a lot of potential dilemmas, which I want to just explore very briefly here. This last one, by the way, there's so many changes happening in the nature of issues around the world now that really don't have a clear and distinguished group that you can say I'm advocating on behalf of. So if you're worried about the way that globalization trends are happening, or SARS and avian bird flu don't recognize borders, and arms trade from the Middle East down to South Africa, and you want to try and work on blocking that in a coalition, you're not really speaking on behalf of a specific group per se. It's very arguable anyway on whose behalf you're speaking. So it's a little bit more complicated. This, in turn, raises a whole host of really difficult questions. So, what right do I have to speak on behalf of others? I mean, that's what's at the core of a lot of this. So, where do we derive our legitimacy as external actors working on behalf of others? Even if we do have legitimacy, to whom are we accountable? What if we make a mistake? What if we do something wrong? What if we pursue interests that are not defensible because we have other agendas we're working on? Who are we accountable to? Even if we're legitimate and accountable, how do we define the content of our message, of what we're trying to advocate for? Maybe even something that seems very innocuous. You might believe in a greater education, let's say, policy, but what should the content of that education policy be? What should children be being taught? What language should it be in? Everything has some dilemma associated with it, so there's no political neutrality here. And then if we're not very good at what we're doing, even if we have all the other factors there, what consequences there for that? And then finally, there's some real conflicts of interest if you work as an advocate for others, because part of your goal is to sustain your efforts. And in order to sustain your efforts, you have to promote yourself, and that can lead to conflicts of interest. So let's take a quick look at that. So, for example, I used to work for Oxfam GB for a while, and they had a pretty effective campaigning and advocacy department, and they used a very simple equation to bring about change. It was victim, villain, solution. If you could explain that in a way that people could grasp in the general public, you could get change. Landmines, main people who produce landmines and governments who allow it to happen are the villains. Ban them is a solution. That works for people. It's really straightforward. But not everything is that simple. There's also this sort of expert-led political advocacy. So, it's self-proclaimed specialist in a particular area. That can be very effective, and you can put, as some people say, put on a suit and go into a boardroom for people who will never have that opportunity. So you can do that for them and shuttle back and forth to the front lines and the boardrooms. And then you can try and be more of a specialist lobbyer, so you know a lot about how land reform change happens, let's say, or what things will be negative if they come into into force, and so trying to resist those. And then, of course, a lot of the things we're talking about here with mass mobilization and petitions and protests and general civil disobedience. And then I've actually provided some additional reading for those who want to go into this further. One of them is a great book by Duncan Green, which many of you might know, that goes into specific examples of people power, as he calls it, with indigenous rights movement, legal reform, Morocco, et cetera. So there's lots of different models out there, all of which have very serious dilemmas and questions about legitimacy. So at this point I talked about self-promotion. You know, in effect, NGOs have brands just like companies do. And let's be honest, we all know that NGOs are fighting for sort of airtime and brand recognition. And the problem with that is that it becomes a self-perpetuating sort of goal. I mean, if you work as an advocacy specialist, that's what you do. You wake up in the morning, you advocate. That's your job. So you have to find things which are worthwhile to advocate for, but there's no question that that's what you do because that's your job. And there's a real, you know, the dilemma is that it may not be the right thing to do all the time for everything. So it shouldn't be part of your goal to just perpetuate yourself, but it has turned into that sort of situation. And the risk is when you conflate the change goal with your brand enhancement. And I don't think there's an honest conversation in the international NGO community about that very fact, but it is a fact. And I've seen it in too many places too often to say that it's not a problem for us to be dealing with. What are the problems more specifically? Well, you know, I've been in meetings where major issues of serious threats to security, poverty, are being put in terms of how this will feed into a major campaign that will raise the profile of the organization, which will in turn bring in funding, which, you know, if you believe that what you do is worthwhile, there is a moral argument to be made that bringing in more funding will ultimately benefit more people. But if it's instrumentalizing the poor to do it, there's a real moral question there, and that does happen. I think another example is that evaluating success can be very unstrategic. So you can set yourself a target, a change goal, and by the end of the year, let's say, you want to increase, let's say decrease funding to, or transferring support from some company in terms of technology to a certain government. It could be a totally legitimate goal. But by the end of the year, you sort of try to measure your success based on the extent to which you achieve that particular goal. But throughout the year, a real strategic approach would require a constant shifting and reevaluating of priorities, of needs, of tactics, operations, strategies, so that you're doing the right thing at the right time. And if we lock ourselves into certain kind of campaign-related goals, and then at the end of the year say, oh, we achieved that goal, that may not really have been the priority of what was needed. So there's a risk there. And then finally, we don't really always want to educate the public in the full level of complexity of the issues we're dealing with, because it's just too complicated, and it's easier to show pictures of people being. I saw the presentation earlier this week that Jack gave about unrest, and if you present this as people not being restful, you know, you're framing an image that's not necessarily constructive. The same applies for international organizations trying to support movements. If you frame it as poor victims who need the knight in shining armor to come from the West to rescue them, that actually does get more money than saying this is a very complicated situation with all sorts of interlocking dynamics going on, and we're going to try to do our best to figure out how we best fit in and know when not to do something and when to do something. People don't want to hear that. So there's a real tension between genuine enhancement of understanding of the public and bringing cash in the door through, I think, sometimes unhelpfully framed campaigns. So with all that in mind, there are some positive things that I would like to point out. I think I'm going to move ahead for time here. There is one framework that CARE International developed for their advocacy strategy, which I thought I'd share with you, which is an interesting sort of four-quadrant model about where we locate ourselves when we're trying to engage change. And the idea that you can be public and confrontational about it, which is something that's not really new, has been around for a while, but the more interesting areas that are starting to grow, I think, is public collaboration with those who we most disagree with. We had one of the senior advocacy officers for Oxfam here a little while ago, and we were asking about this graph and saying, where do you locate yourself now? And what do you think is most risky? And he was saying, well, it used to be the public confrontational was the sort of main naming and shaming, criticizing. Now we realize that there are solutions to be found in working with in the most difficult relationships, probably private collaboration is the worst, riskiest thing, because people don't want to know what we're doing about it. But actually being confrontational publicly can also be unhelpful unless it's strategic or balanced. So this is a sort of way that some of the NGOs try and locate what the most effective approach is. So I will just give a couple of very quick examples before I close for some discussion here. Actually still on time. So I wanted to share with you for a second here some examples that I've worked on directly with being an international organization trying to support people working on a peaceful social change process. So the first one is when I worked in Kenya. There was this, any of you know or from Kenya would know that in the center and north of the country there's been a long history of very violent clashes between pastoralists and agriculturalists. Agriculturalists who are based in one area, pastoralists who are mobile, and when they sometimes come into contact with the proliferation of small arms technology, the violence has been tremendous. And there's been a real pattern of reprisals. One attack automatically triggers a reprisal. And we spent a lot of time working as an international external actor in discussing methods and approaches to thinking about conflict differently, including some of the things that have been around for a while, training people in advance for how you would deal with, violent confrontations. So the first time that I actually went to a project site after the training, that very night before, there was an attack on the village. It was in Isiolo in central Kenya. There was an attack on the village, really quite horrific. Houses were burned, there was widespread killing and rape, and many of the items were stolen from the house. Most of the livestock, so about 1,000 cattle, all taken. And so, we said, well, my gosh, what did you do? How did you handle the situation? And they said, well, 100% guaranteed we can tell you that absolutely would have gone back and tried to do as much damage, if not more, to their side. But instead, we decided to organize a group of village elders to go over and discuss, and we negotiated, and we came back with about 800 head of cattle, and we didn't kill anybody. And we have now set up a new pact, which, by the way, did hold over time. And it was the first moment they had tried to break out of their two choices for dealing with violence, which was step back and accept it or massive retaliation. Those are the two options. They'd never really tried to experiment with expanding the menu of options. And so the theory was the bigger the menu, the less likely violence. The second example was working in Burundi, where we were supporting a small peace organization in the center of the country, a town called Gitega. The Hutu militia passed through a community and had burned a school down and killed 47 students who were burned alive in the school. And there was a man who was the head of this peace committee that we worked with who kind of made a name for himself by going down to the police station where many people were just rounded up after this happened without any evidence whatsoever, just thrown in prison. And he said, this was a horrible crime. However, now this is the precise moment where we have to make a decision about perpetuating violence or standing up for peace. And those people in prison actually weren't guilty. There were people who were guilty and they should be punished. They left. Those people are not guilty. And it might make us feel better to round up the other and persecute them. But this is what conflict resolution, this is what nonviolence means. We can't perpetuate this. And he ended up founding a committee, a bigger one, that went on to work around the whole country. And any of you who follow Burundi know that it's almost unbelievable that these former rebel groups are now running a country together with all the problems they have. Nobody thought it was going to be possible. But it was activists like this who formed part of the committee to form this new government, bringing all the rebel groups together, saying that we will have an election in 18 months. There'll be one ethnicity will be president. They will stand down, and the other ethnicity will be there for 18 months. Then we'll hold a national election, and we will run the country jointly. 7 years later, today, that's still the case. Nobody in a million years would have dreamed it was possible. It was those sorts of individuals with the sort of support, I think, in part, from external actors that made this possible. So just a couple of quick pictures to represent this. This was a workshop I was in about 2 weeks ago in Kenya with a Kenyan sharing some of the experiences I was just talking about with Burundians and Somalis about the Somali peace process. So that's an example of the interaction between different regions and peace processes and learning. And by the way, Interpeace, many of you might know, is a big European-based conflict resolution NGO that had an office for years in Somalia, and the head of that office, this is an international NGO, but a Somali head, is now the president of Somalia. So, and he cites what he learned as a peace activist with an international organization as one of the best training grounds for him to be able to bring people together in Somalia as the president now. This is a workshop I was at a few months ago in the center of the Congo in the rainforest. That's actually a research station in the back, with people from the Indonesian rainforests, from Peru and Colombia and Cameroon, Belize, all sharing experiences of indigenous movements trying to fight for their rights in the face of deforestation and multinational corporations taking over. So again, it's an example of the interconnectedness of the need to understand public, private. And then this is a picture of, I've been working for about 2 years with the White House on training senior White House officials and presidential appointees precisely on the skills needed to listen to and understand movements that are far removed from power but need to be heard. And this is something that a lot of people don't really realize that's happening with the administration right now, is that an extra effort made to outreach, to listen to people who would not otherwise be heard. And they actually they recognize they don't know that much about what's going on in far-flung corners of the world and what kinds of issues are crucial to understand to make policy changes that are relevant. And then lastly, this is working with community groups in Hawaii, and we're drawing systems maps. And this is from complexity theory, not being systematic, but in terms of multi-factor, multi-causal relationships in a complex system, using complex systems theory to design the movement in Hawaii for indigenous Hawaiian rights to be protected against the growing economic development happening in that state. So I think I'm going to actually end here and go to, I'll skip to the last slide. This is some other stuff, Kashmir, some other examples I've been working on. I'm just going to end on this slide here now, which is that I would say that there's sort of 5 things that I've picked up working on this for 20 years, which I think has really captured for me the intensity of the changes that have been going on. It's not that these things did not exist as advocacy began, but I think it's more intense and more heightened. The need to work at the absolute front lines through to the highest levels of policy is now expected. You're expected to be able to, and sometimes the same individual is expected to get off the plane in a conflict zone and then be able to go the next day to senior level policy meetings and be able to discuss everything in between. But that's required for successful advocacy now. The level of multi-actor complexity is extremely heightened now. And working with the people, the example I was going to give with Kashmir, with police beating people in the streets, what did we do? I've been working with community members going straight into the police department, training the police on nonviolence, the very same people who were beaten by those police members. I remember when I first went in, the leader met with the police chief, and he said, "Have I met you before?" And he said, "Yeah, we had a meeting before." And it turns out that, yeah, he was interrogated and beaten for hours in the police department. And he went in to train them. So forging the most difficult relationships, recognizing that the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors, all three have to be present in the discussions if we're going to make any progress. The level of multidisciplinary theory and practice has is much more heightened and complex. And then the level of regional interchange has always been there, but it's so much more heightened. The progress you can make in Burundi without worrying about Kenya, in Belize and Colombia and Peru and Ecuador, but not Brazil, on protecting indigenous rights in the rainforest, let alone South American rainforest from the Congo forest basin, from rainforests in Borneo, are all in the same tropical strip. So if we're not working with companies and governments and policy change, then really you're not making progress unless you're weaving it all together. So it's on a much more heightened level of multi-regional requirements to understand how to bring about change. So I'm going to end there and open this up for debate for everything that we've talked about today and see what you think, and we're open to questions and challenges and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Rob, I've got it's not so much a question, it's a comment, and I'd love your response. So I've worked in NGOs, and I'm currently accompanying the movement in West Papua, an Indonesian colony. And a number of, I guess there's a couple of situations there. One is that a number of NGOs have been forced out of the country by the Indonesian government. The other thing that's happened is big NGOs, including Oxfam, including Caritas, have actually withdrawn their support from human rights organisations. They've withdrawn their funding from organisations that are mobilising for environmental and social justice. These aren't groups that are working for independence. These are groups that are working for more limited goals. And my analysis is that they've done this because they prefer a cuddle with the Indonesian government. They prefer the kind of public collaboration that you're talking about, rather than really pushing for, you know, significant social change outcomes. And when we've had conversations about, well, can't you find other ways around this? You know, can't you work through other program partners? Can't you shift support, you know, to a neighbouring country? There's kind of been little willingness to really engage in some of those conversations. And I know this is an internal struggle. I know a group like Oxfam's not a monolith. You know, you've got a range of opinions within that. But I just, you know, the rhetoric that Duncan Green kind of talks about just seems so far removed from the reality when it comes to a situation like West Papua. And I just wondered if you got a comment about that.
Sure, there's a couple of reactions, and I'm sure Maria would have some as well. So firstly, I would say that I don't know that particular region, but I think that that's not surprising to hear that. And what you say is right, that you know, larger NGOs have a primary mandate, mainly of poverty reduction. So, and the definition of poverty can be widespread, and you could say, well, that includes everything. We see poverty as meaning all these different things. That doesn't really get you off the hook. Ultimately, there's decisions to be made between promoting the rights of people as an intrinsic goal, even if there's no measurable economic change in the outcome in their lives, is a different mandate than economic development. And those NGOs I've been parts of those internal discussions. In fact, Oxfam redefined all of its goals to 5 goals, 5 strategic change objectives, they call them, SEOs. Each one starts with the right to life, the right to security, whatever, food security. And yet, I don't really think they mean that. They did say that, they wrote it down, they voted on it globally. I'm not really sure they actually mean it when they say that, though, because when the push comes to shove, there's a choice that has to be made. Some people go one way and others go the other way internally within Oxfam. So that doesn't surprise me. The second thing I would say is that there are some valid arguments for that. It's not just cowardly running away. I don't think it's that simple. At the same time, I also would go, you know, having worked a lot with human rights organizations, I worked for the UN as a human rights officer, it's not clear that the going down with guns blazing kind of metaphor is appropriate here either. Like, you know, you can say this is wrong and this is the oppressive government and we should be fighting back and complaining. That isn't necessarily the obvious opposite extreme either. Again, I don't know that environment, but I do know that having worked in a lot of repressive environments and having lost a lot of colleagues in violent circumstances, that there's always a way to do better than saying, well, there's no one who's going to work with us, so we're kind of stuck here. There's always creative relationships, partnerships to be forged, and it's just a challenge of going as far as you can to exploit every single opportunity. And frankly, it's a lot easier now than it was when I started before the internet. So I would not lose hope, even though I'm not surprised by that description. Wow, lots of hands. I don't know if you want to...
No, I don't have anything to add, but I would just say I would love also in general to hear what participants think have been, based on your work in the field, effective and not effective forms of assistance, whether governmental or non-governmental. So I'd love to hear some of those anecdotes. But anyway, go ahead.
Maria may be aware of the situation in Madagascar in the last 4 years after the coup d'etat, that overthrew elected President Ravalomanana, who had to go on exile in South Africa. And since then, the international community, led by the Southern Africa Development Community, has been trying to broker a kind of agreement to set things right. And then every time it's well, the French ambassador, the latest one, in the week after his arrival in the country, ran and presented his letters of credence to the coup perpetrator. And when he was interviewed after that ceremony, what he said was, well, I don't think that it is timely yet for Mr. Ravalomanana to come back. So I wonder how the rest of the international community address this kind of issue when one major component still behaves as if they were still in a French colony.
I mean, there's no easy answer to that, but I would just say if the ambassador is saying that the situation is not ripe or whatever, then often it's the responsibility and the real task of the movement and the opposition to make the situation ripe. Because often, frankly, policymakers in general and diplomats, others, don't change course or act in a different way unless they feel really pressured and compelled to do so. So it's almost creating a sense of urgency. And often the thing that convinces governments and others, whether it's in Egypt and otherwise, because everyone here knows that U.S. government did not side with the opposition in Egypt until fairly late in that game. That's pretty clear. But the only reason governments change, including U.S., is that they start to see that there is a massive, broad-based, popular movement that's being really disruptive and, oh, by the way, has a pretty decent vision for what comes after the status quo. So if movements can provide that, that's often the impetus that governments need to change course. And even then, they may not change course. So in this case, what is the opposition doing to ripen the situation and convince the ambassador that actually it is a ripe situation?
A few more hands. Okay, how about
just to look at the flip side, what happens when NGOs or advocacy groups are kicked out of the country or blocked from doing their work, or as in the case of Egypt, taken to court? Most of the NGOs are taken to court, and as were the NGO workers. So where does that leave activists or movements within that country who depend on these NGOs for a lot of assistance, be it financial or in terms of theoretical work or just democratization processes, for example?
I mean, a quick answer is that I don't see that as a major obstacle, quite frankly. Being kicked out of a country used to be the good old days when it was like, before the internet and Skype and JetBlue and that sort of thing, where people could be on the ground all over the place and really low-tech communications. It was a bigger deal than it is today. The truth is, I've worked on a project for 2 years just from outside the country with Skype, with weekly meetings, with people from all sorts of countries involved on strategy, sharing information, and it's pretty hard to shut that down. It really is. Now, I'm not saying that there's no changes in the way that you have to operate as opposed to being in country, but I think that concern is less worrying than the fear that can be created by the threats of various sorts of things that, along the lines of being PNG'd from a country. Whereas, for people who are staying in the country, threats like, your kids will be thrown out of school, or all of a sudden people won't come home, and that sort of thing is much harder to deal with than the actual physical presence. I think that's just a lot less important these days, even working in extremely remote places. I lived for a year and a half in the hills of Laos, and I have to say that by the time that it became connected, which was the time I was there, you could be in touch with people all over the world instantly, and it really didn't affect our ability to organize and implement. I think it was the day-to-day threats to the members of the movement that was the big challenge in my experience anyway. Maybe we should take a few in a row and then respond, yeah? So how about over here on this side, Nora, and then, can't see, Anna? Okay. Oh, thank you, okay. Nora.
I think two comments. First to Maria, you were asking, what can they do in terms of diplomats and so on, and what they have done and so on. My question is, how can we get diplomats to do more there's a lot of lazy diplomats out there. There's a lot of diplomats, you know, really like their cushy little offices in whatever country they're in. And I think, you know, they can play a massively important role in terms of attending demonstrations and doing the kind of protection work that you're alluding to in the Ukraine. But how can we get them to do more of that? In Cambodia, where I work, you know, we don't see that. That's not what they're doing. And then a point to Robert. I think, like, in terms of INGOs, and then we're talking about financial support. One of the things that I'm very concerned about with the growing grassroots movement in Cambodia is how INGO financial support can be extremely detrimental to these grassroots groups in sort of pushing them towards becoming NGOs, right? Because there's all these, you know, reporting requirements. You've got to have your log frame, etc. And that tends to destroy the movements because it puts so much focus on the log frames that they lose their momentum in a way. And so maybe for me, like the INGO support is really good when it's focused on training, when it's focused on access to policymakers, and bringing people to different places, having experiences, and sort of doing that networking and the training much more so than doing the financial support.
Okay, should we take a few more? And then, okay, Anna?
Like 2 points, one for each. Like I was wondering when you were talking about the training police and armies and non-violent tactics, I was just wondering to which extent you are giving them your knowledge and your weapons in order to use them against you. Like I mean, I work in Palestine, and I could never ever imagine people of the non-violent movement training the Israeli army in non-violent tactics, because I mean, you are giving them your knowledge, your tactics, and they won't use them in, you know, your own benefit. They will use them in their own benefit. And so I don't see, like, maybe I didn't understand the point, so if you could like explain this. And then like also in regarding the work with the diplomat community, we work a lot with the European External Action Service. And just like an example that happened a couple of weeks ago, 26 activists were arrested, and the people from the European External Action Service called us to tell us, hey, we want to help. What we can do to help you in order to do that? So I told them, like, well, it would be great if you can show up in the trial and, you know, in the military court, because this really helps. And so they started asking us for a full CV of the 26 people that were arrested, a legal statement proving that they were never ever been involved in a violent action, or, you know, or being convicted of a crime or whatsoever. So the list of demands, you know, it was really impossible. And of course, like I was telling them, like, we need you to act right now. I cannot wait till next week for you to, you know, issue a statement that is not going to be, you know, effective any longer. And so I think like the bureaucracy within the diplomatic missions really makes very, very difficult the process. And on top of that, in the specific context of Israel and Palestine, they always get back to you with the same answer of, sorry, it's too political, I cannot legally into it.
I wanted to make a comment and have your reaction. I think that NGO support comes largely from the United States, and or especially our government, or well-known agencies in the United States, have very limited possibilities in the world, so long as our national policies, domestic, international, are dominated by military and by the push to maintain the economic advantages of colonialism for the West. that in many cases they cause people danger, great vulnerability, and in other cases, local people will not and cannot do the hard, perplexing work in their own scenery and among their own people. One of the notions that came out of the civil rights movement that is very little talked about is Martin Luther King's insistence that this foreign policy, violent policies, would be affecting other peoples in the world for generations to come. That we'll be fighting our wars endlessly. And then he said that the United States is the #1 purveyor of violence in the world. Take another look. And then also, in the 60s, in the mid-60s, I concluded and continue to think it is valid that my government, not my American people, who I think are far better than most of our state governments and most of federal government, our government is the #1 enemy of peace and justice in the world. So I guess I'm just simply wanting a reaction to my sense.
Let's hear it, Maria.
Representative of the enemy.
I understand your perspective, but yeah, I mean, there's bad stuff that we do that any government does, and there's also very good stuff that we do and other governments do. And I think part of it is emphasizing also what's done that's good and reinforcing that at the same time that you criticize and critique, you know, the parts that are not so good. And so in terms of like militarization and, you know, engaging in wars overseas unnecessarily, I think you see that there's been a change in public opinion within the US about engaging in wars of choice. This has taken time, decades to change, and it's still not a perfect consensus, obviously, but there's a lot more reluctance on the part of the American government to get involved in these kind of wars. And I frankly think the more that we advance in this area of nonviolent resistance, and we see that there are alternatives, for example, to advancing goals that doesn't involve US military intervention, then the better we are. And that's going to take time, but in my view, that's what's going to change things, is advancing this field. And the policymakers will follow.
Nice answer. I'll just make a quick reaction too, which is that there's actually a link with, I think, the 3 last questions. One is that there are absolute limits to international NGO and other forms of support. And it comes with this burden of having to put frameworks and structures and log frames and budgets around it that won't be there unless, unless you have those things, the money won't be there. So it's a real conundrum, not only for the recipients, but for the NGOs themselves. And at some point, there's a question about who needs whom more. Sometimes the donors need to get X amount out the door by the end of the year. And then the NGOs are in turn feeling like they have to do the same. And all of a sudden, there's this system that's perpetuated that is not cause-driven, but kind of bureaucracy-driven. So I agree with that entirely. Also, on the scale of the benefit of this, global aid altogether is something like $150 billion, not including unofficial aid from, say, non-OECD countries like China and foundations. But even then, it's some $200–300 billion, let's say. But when you compare that to global trade and budgets of governments and everything, it is minuscule, absolutely. So I think there are real limits to the impact. I guess my main point about what this crucial issue you're raising is how do we deal with a situation where we see a very powerful institution that is having impacts that we don't like. Similar to your question, the Kashmir police, we're working with them. Why? The answer for me personally has become, over time, direct engagement. It's not lobbing stones from a distance type of attitude, personally. Now, it's changed. I used to be different. I used to be much more of a campaigning activist. I was waving a flag on the Houses of Parliament the moment that Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed. We were protesting. We were really angry. And now I realize, like, actually, I want to be on the other side of the doors now. I want to be in the White House talking about how change has to happen. I want to be with the Kashmiri police talking about why nonviolence matters, rather than on the outside. And by the way, the evidence is overwhelming that educating people on alternatives to violence increases the likelihood that they'll choose nonviolent options. It's not somehow that you're helping them play their game better. There's all kinds of evidence, which I'm happy to talk about later, that it's not somehow doing yourself. That is a common fear. It'll do ourselves a disservice if we don't hide and protect our tools, because if they get their hands on them, they're going to use them against us. Actually, we want them to. We want them to use negotiation, nonviolence, creative alternatives. So.
But it's not the activist going to talk with the police or so on. It's you as an sort of external actor. I think it's a different.
Well, we're with the activists in the room. We're not on our own. But anyway, that's.
I see the challenge of that applying to this case.
Yeah.
Palestinians.
Okay.
Yes.
I work with the Department of Defense, and I'm trying to increase knowledge of strategic nonviolent conflict or civil disobedience within DoD, and trying to change from within instead of trying to agitate from externally. And I've been really encouraged by the openness within the department. I'm going to go brief the Pentagon on Tuesday, and Lindsey Graham on Tuesday as well. So the openness is there, but these changes I think are incremental, that people just need to be educated about and know that there are other options. But I do have a question about the convergence of humanitarianism and violence, like humanitarian violence, like to say Benghazi, and playing the role, well, when you meet people who are very skeptical about strategic nonviolence and the effectiveness of strategic nonviolence or civil disobedience, how do you answer them when they say that civil disobedience is inherently political? You're actually interfering with the government, and that I find a lot of people very concerned about reciprocity, and that maybe the Chinese government comes to the United States and helps disillusioned workers organize and agitate against the United States. That's a worst case nightmare scenario that some people who are very skeptical of this practice raise. And I don't have an answer for that right now. So I was wondering if that's something else that you encounter, or if you have any ideas about that.
So that actually linked to the question too about something like hearing back from diplomats that this activity is too political.
Yeah.
So for example, in both cases, it's, life, everything is political in life. Anything that involves like shifts in power is inherently political. But there's a difference between advancing partisan goals, so supporting a particular party, in a conflict, versus in this case, and when it comes to attending trials and visiting people in prison, all this, it's a human rights case. And so it seems like the better angle is to focus on, how to support people to enjoy basic human rights that all governments have signed up to under, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, all of these treaties, and address it more from a less political frame and a more human rightsy frame, and that you may find more resonance in that case. Because if it goes strict to the, can we use this, to basically put another party or group in power, then of course everybody is going to be nervous about this kind of activity. So, but it's great that you're doing this in
I have two small questions to you, Maria. The first one is, what makes a difference between supporting movements by other governments and the interference in the internal affairs of that government? So I see here there is some sort of overlap between the two. My second question is about the option of militarization of Syrian opposition. You know that Qatar, Saudi Arabia are involved in that with help or supervision from the USA. So what's your opinion regarding that, knowing that weapons, who are using weapons now in Syria and how things are happening, and with those extremists?
That's,
perfectly easy question. And I'm in such a great position to answer that forthrightly, honestly. No, just quickly, and we can certainly chat on the boat about this. Why don't we chat about this on the boat, actually? No, I mean, I don't want to get too much into policy. I mean, I have personal opinions about what's going on. I mean, as I said before this, it's been one of the most difficult personal and professional things in my life to be able to see what has happened in Syria, to go from a massive popular multi-sect uprising against a dictatorship to morph into a civil war like what we're seeing now. And I think it's always, but this goes back to the first finding, and I know Eric has done a lot of work on this, when you begin to engage in armed resistance in these environments, and oh, by the way, nonviolent resistance is twice as effective against dictators as armed resistance empirically. So I'm sure Erica will hopefully present the findings of our book at some point during FSI. So nonviolent resistance has a massive comparative advantage. But once you go to the armed route, and I get all the reasons why Syrians did it, I really do. And a lot, you can debate how much of a choice it was, they were pressured to do it, I understand that. But once you go down that route, you become beholden to external actors who have agendas that are very different from the original goals and ideals of the movement. And so that's the risk you run. So everything may seem hard and bleak when you're in the nonviolent phase and you're seeing lots of people being repressed and your friends getting killed, but you have to have in the back of your mind, if the violence escalates and more and more people take up arms, where are the weapons going to be coming from? Where's the funding? Where's the training? And oh, by the way, what do those outside actors really want in my country? And that has to go into sort of the strategic thinking about this. So I think it became very difficult for the Syrian opposition to maintain control over their revolution when it became violent. So without getting into more of policy, that would be my, my observation of the...
And what about the distinction between supportive movements and interference in internal?
Yeah, so I think here, and it gets to the previous one about the partisan nature. So if the goal is, you're putting money to support a particular organization that's trying to win seats in parliament, or you're trying to give money to a particular organization that is trying to, say, have political influence, it becomes more of a borderline case. But if you are providing assistance, and what kind of assistance are we talking about here? We're not talking about guns. We're not talking about, we're talking about, like books and materials, trainings in nonviolent activism, all this kind of stuff. If you're providing assistance that basically allows people to realize their human rights, which means assembly, freedom of speech, access to information without governmental repression, I think that actually all of that is protected and legitimized under international law.
Yeah, but I think
that's what is called humanitarian assistance, what you have just defined now, which is legitimate, as you say. But I think it's not the same thing as supporting two conflicting people. I mean, like in Syria, they are fighting with arms.
Yeah.
And the other point I wanted to make, anyway, I didn't want to get into that. Look, it's a controversial thing in my mind, but I don't want to go there. Can you define to me, how will it work? Let's say, how far do you go with assisting? Let's say in South Africa, I'm sure you know, there's this youth leader that was opposing, that was a darling that brought the president there. And now when the president got in, of course, he knew all along that he was a useless, or what do they call useful idiot. Kicks him out. Now, the poor guy, the government have put now every kind of allegation against him, charge him for money laundering, tax evasion, all and all and all that. And it is obvious that they do that for the purposes of silencing him and destroying him that fashion. The question, of course, I'm interested in really, when you talk earlier on about the assistance that is given, would such a person, although the government knew that he was, like many in government who are guilty of the same crime this guy has done, but they were doing it together when he was in favor. But now he's outside, they isolate him. And it's obvious that they are picking him up for that. Would the diplomatic handbook that you were talking about, where the diplomats need to get in, do you think that they will assist this guy in fighting his court cases? Because that's what, sticking to the humanitarian assistance. What will the position be, according to your reading of the diplomatic, what do you call it?
No, I mean, this guide doesn't give like prescriptions or directives, like in this situation you must do this, blah, blah, blah. So this is like literally just a spectrum of tools available to diplomats and embassies to, you know, help dissidents, activists, this sort of thing. So in this case, I mean, in terms of what would apply, you know, obviously, you know, sending certain messages to the government about, you know, what their recommendation would be to how to deal with this guy. You know, I don't know the case. I don't understand all the details all that well.
My question is,
yes, sir. Okay, yes.
Look, the other one about the Syrian is a strong one. I don't want to talk about that, but honestly, I want to know this one from your interpretation of that as an information. The other one, I've got definite ideas about it. What I'm saying, he believes that the government is trembling on his human rights, okay? And as you know, there in South Africa, there are people who are fighting like me. I want the government, I don't want to go to government, I don't want to do anything, but what makes the government not to like me at the moment is just that I say, come back guys, let's get into the constitution of the country. Run the country only on the basis of that. I'm one of those people who say, and there are many such people. But he was inside there. But when he got kicked out, now he's a victim. He also say, oh yes, look, this government now is doing this and this and this, and he points to those things. And the government nailed it. Now I'm saying in today, because I don't know today, I haven't dealt with diplomats. I used to deal with them then. But what happened now? Do they use that what do you call it, handbook, to say poor Malema must be assisted or not be assisted?
Well, I mean, it would be my dream if all the diplomats that you ever encounter say, oh my gosh, you know, according to the diplomat's handbook, I should be doing X, Y, and Z. I mean, that would be, my dream would come true if that ever happened. So my guess is he may not be familiar with the diplomat's handbook. That's my guess.
I ask a follow-up related to a follow-up question.
Please.
So, Marie, one of the questions that has come up with the diplomat's handbook, and this might relate to Chris's question, is just the state has a policy, and how much leeway does a diplomat have to interpret that policy? So, say for example, in this situation, the state had a policy regarding, you know, something from Washington about how this situation should be dealt with, and say it didn't. What's the leeway of the diplomat using some of the tools in the diplomat's handbook to respond to such a situation?
So sometimes it can be very hard.
Yeah.
So if there's a specific, policy directive towards certain individuals, whatever, then sometimes it can be very difficult for diplomats to.
They don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the problem is if you're a diplomat and you go out to post and you sort of go rogue right away and you just start disobeying everything, whatever, you're not going to last very long. Yeah. So smart diplomats have to find a way to work within the system a little bit, deal with some unsavory characters, deal with some regime types that maybe you wouldn't want to, for example, in order to build relationships and have leverage that otherwise wouldn't exist. And with those relationships, sometimes then you can interpret things a little bit differently.
And one thing I would just add to this, because I think Maria's handled these very difficult questions very gracefully and very skillfully, and I think what I would just add is that we get this discussion all the time at Fletcher. People will say, okay, here's these issues, and now I can give you a very specific case. What do you think about that? And it's not the kind of thing where you can say, well, yeah, look up, okay, on chapter 12 it says you do this. But I do think what we're talking about here is a range of key data, of dilemmas, and of frameworks that you have to work within to make that you need to make your decisions, to make tough choices. You can look at other dilemmas that are out there. It's on a spectrum. You got to figure out where you fall. Do you want to take NGO money? You can do that, and it'll allow you to do a lot of things. But it comes with strings attached. There's no free lunch. You have to make a choice, and there's pros and cons. Do you want to decide to go off the strict line of policy and get more done, but there's a cost there? It's a dilemma. It's on a continuum. You have to make a choice. There's different sort of levels of engagement you could focus on, and you shoot higher. If you talk the West Papua example, you take too much money from NGOs and then they walk away, you're sunk. It's a choice. There's risks associated. So there's no kind of like straightforward, this is what you do. I can give you an example that's not, on your list there, so what do you do about that? It's a little bit of an unfair, I think, challenge, because what the purpose of these sorts of tools is to help inform people on how to be more effective and strategic in the choices they make and the actions they take. So that's what this is all about, but there's no kind of magic bullet. The good news is there's lots of options, but there's no one specific option. Yeah, you had a hand. You seem to be reacting to a lot of what
She's going to launch a sit-in if we don't call it.
No, I think I'm not going to refer to the Diplomat's Handbook because obviously that's now becoming a topical issue. But I really want to be able to have Maria's understanding of what does it look like to an ambassador when he now has to weigh economic interests of multinationals knocking through his foreign affairs office to try and get a foot in the door of the diamond fields of Chiadzwa or the forest in Russia against political things. Because this is my understanding of where foreign, the ambassadors go wrong, is they now have to become complicit and take a soft approach with the dictators, and this is what causes them to have the challenge when there's an uprising suddenly in Egypt. How do we deal with this now? Because actually most of our businessmen have invested interests. How does that look for that ambassador? Is it our lobby for democracy, or is it the lobby for financial gain of this multinational, very rich people coming, I don't know through which routes, how do they work?
I mean, obviously supporting economic opportunities for American businesses and countries is an objective of any ambassador in any post or any country. But
balancing, how do you balance?
So the question is, so for example, if there are certain firms that are engaging in practices that are inherently unstable, that are causing major problems, disenfranchising people, whatever, I think the argument to be made is, we support your investment because this helps us create jobs locally, whatever, but it may be problematic for you to be putting all your eggs in this basket because these practices are unstable and it will likely result in unrest. And then this will cause you to lose money. So if you link it to the bottom line, but show how, not getting the politics right can have a bad economic impact, then perhaps the ambassador will listen. But he does care about economic, these economic interests.
Okay. Then the other part of my question,
yes,
was to the gentleman there. The experiences that we often have, you can rest now, is that quite often the donor community will look for activists and then refresh them or bring them back as the gatekeepers, the program officers, the this and the that. And often the challenges that then come in is those people come from certain cliques or certain agendas, and they become gatekeepers, or they make sure that only their friends will get the funding, only their friends will, and they become protectionists of those cliques. How can the international NGOs try and make sure that there's more transparent processes, or is it actually not a good thing to bring activists with vested interests and too many personal connections from an area in to where that situation presents?
So you definitely hit on a topic that I have a lot of very strong views on, but we don't have that much time. So let me just say a couple of quick things to that question. First of all, I'm actually not sure that international NGOs do actually select activists and bring them in. I think they say they love to do that when they can, and look for change agents and things like that. The truth is they actually don't do that very well, or even try to very often, in my opinion, because there's too many quote-unquote risks. So there is this idea out there, which I think anyone who seriously looks at any element of development work, human rights work, civil resistance, peace building, nobody will disagree with what Maria said, which is that it's all political. It's fiction that somehow you can give aid in an apolitical way. Those days, where people said that are over. Yet somehow there is this underlying fear that if it looks too political, you'll have all this trouble, so we can't be political. So for that reason, I don't think actually activists are selected. But in those cases where, on the other hand, one of the big tensions...
But sorry, in an environment that is very, very difficult to operate in, like Zimbabwe,
yeah,
those are the people who they expect to come in because they think they're brave enough to actually run an office and make sure that the NGO has a foot in the door. So those are the obvious people.
Who end up there might be very well those people. What I'm saying is I'm not convinced that that's a result of some strategic planning done by the leadership of the international NGOs. I wish it was, but you're giving them too much credit if you think that, in my opinion. Secondly, though, I think the big dilemma is that as an external actor, whether government or non-governmental, you bring with you a lot of very difficult, complicated baggage that people rightly have reasons to be distrustful of or worried about. So therefore, you have to work, of course, with people who are from the struggle that you're trying to work to support. And whenever you do that, in whatever place you do that, whoever you select, whoever ends up working with you, adds a whole new element of your, when we do these with our students' conflict analyses, one of the big pieces of that is the internal analysis of the partners you're working with. So everything I talked about before, the risks of, say, self-promotion of an international NGO, that applies internally to a movement. I'm sure we could hear lots of stories about conflicts within a given movement, about one person seems to be getting more prominence than another, and maybe they're taking the stage for reasons other than the cause, but for their own gain, and all that sort of stuff absolutely is a big part of it. So how do we deal with this tension of working with, quote unquote, the local staff, who we sort of sometimes use heroic language to define people, when actually they suffer from struggles that we do about how to organize ourselves effectively. It's an attractive and tempting notion that we have a leader who's working on the inside with us to bring about change, when that leader may or may not represent everybody's views in the group that they supposedly lead. So we recognize that that's a real problem. And I think the third thing I would say is that it's not also true that it's not only one direction, I think. A lot of the change is that people who work for these big, maybe with an embassy or the UN or an NGO, then leave and take with them, which I think is a positive thing, some of the language that they can use to engage with the international community back to their original organization or new local organization, which I think is a lot more effective than the other direction. I think your ability to influence goes down a lot of the time when you join a bureaucratic NGO. So I think it works in both directions as well. But you've hit on, there's so many other things we can talk about in just that one question, actually.
I just have a comment to Maria's comment. Sorry. When you were talking about the Syrians moved from a non-violent resistance into a civil war, to me it sounded as if somewhat of the blame was put on the people, the Syrian people. That's just to me. However, my question is, in the past 2 years, what's been happening throughout the Arab world, the U.S. didn't support any of the non-violent protests. They didn't support the Bahraini one. They didn't support the Egyptian one until the very end. The Tunisian one, they kept silent. And yet, when it came to military intervention or supporting the military option, they were all for it. So to say that the U.S. policy is shifting, I mean, to me it sounds very weak because it hasn't been shifting in our eyes from the way we're seeing it the past 2 years.
No, I don't think I argue that our policy is.
And I just like the USA was in full support of the SPLM since the inception of the SPLM, which was civil war. So Sudan, we had civil war for 25 years. You supported war. You supported military intervention. You fully supported cessation. You never went for any other option. So I think that argument is, I mean, the U.S. policy hasn't changed in the past 50 years. And it's still a long way for it to go, for it to change.
I agree with that point completely. And I mean, in terms of the Syrian point, never would I look at the Syrian situation and wag fingers, whatever, at the Syrian people from going from non-violent to violent. As I said, I understand all the reasons why it happened. I try to put myself in the shoes and imagine what my response would be if I see, you know, my mother raped, my brother killed, my sister tortured. How would I respond? I get it. So I would never say, blame them for this. And the ultimate blame for all of this has to be pointed back to a dictatorial regime. that sort of used massive repressive violence against a peaceful uprising when it began. My only point with that is, you know, as soon as, if you're in the opposition and you're having discussions about, okay, what path should we really focus on now? Because I don't believe actually all nonviolent options were exhausted in the Syrian case. That's one thing I don't believe. But I get why they took violence. My only point with that is, once the movement is overshadowed with violence, and you begin to rely on armed insurrection, there are consequences to that. There are consequences to that for your movement, and likely what the regime's response to that will be. That's my only point. But never would I look at the Syrian people and struggle and hold them accountable for, you know, the destruction that's being wrought in the country. And yes, U.S. policy is not consistent in the Middle East. People have serious concerns and critiques of the way that we've engaged with regimes versus populations. I think the Arab Spring took a lot of people in government by surprise. But you know, the one thing I think about when you say, well, we didn't help, the US government didn't help Tunisia, didn't help Egypt, I think to myself, but you succeeded. You know what? And it's like, I'm conflicted about that, because on the one hand, I would say, well, I wish maybe earlier on we had recognized that, engaged with, you know, civil society and the nonviolent activists, but at the same time it gives me hope in the sense that you actually didn't need US support.
But it has supported, the US have supported these dictators for decades.
Yes.
Yes, we succeeded, that's true, but we could have succeeded in the past.
And that support is making any changes for the future. It's going to take a longer time.
My only message would be force policymakers, force embassies, diplomats to do the right thing. You may be surprised, eventually they'll do the right thing when they're forced to do the right thing. And there's more in your control, I think, than you think.
I think we have one more comment before we finish.
I'd like to make two strategic observations for my colleagues here. One is that a lot of these groups that Rob was talking about, Save the Children, CARE, and other groups, it is not widely known, but I served on the board of one of those groups for 12 years. Most of their money comes from young professional women. Secondly, Anne-Marie Couture and I will be talking tomorrow about certain ways that women can create political space that is not open to men in civil resistance. And in my personal opinion, I would say that the United States government has not realized how much it could do by helping women's groups. Let's remember, Jim said Nashville started with women. Custa, Port Elizabeth started with middle-aged women. And tomorrow, Anne-Marie and I are going to talk about how the Montgomery bus boycott had been hatching for 3 years with the Women's Political Caucus in the black community in Montgomery. Thank you.
I really want to make one last point about that. Sorry, but I guess I want one last comment I'd like to make is I understand why the focus of this discussion ended up for quite some time being on the U.S. government. I would like to recall that the theme, though, about this session about external assistance, in my experience, has hugely been related to external from sources other than the U.S. government. So a lot of the pictures that I was showing up there, that's why I have Kenyans and Burundians helping Somalis, and the picture of Indonesians and Belize and Congo working together, and non-European donors, and the rise of donors from Islamic countries and from the East. India and China are at the table now in ways that they never have been before, international donor support. So I think this is the trend, this is the movement, and we need to be ready to engage with that discussion, as well as the one about the U.S. government.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.